I think, in fact, for reasons I'll go into in a moment, that's an underestimate. I think it's even worse than that for livestock. I'll come to that in just a moment. After that, the chair of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the worldwide scientific body that issues reports on what's causing climate change and the state of climate change, actually came out and said that people should eat less meat. That it's a very carbon-intensive commodity, admitting that they were afraid to say it until recently, but now they have said it and more people are starting to realise this. But you might say, is this only about factory farming? Is it only feedlot production that is causing this? Well, unfortunately the answer is no, it's not. This is a farm quite near Princeton, an organic beef farm, where the conditions really look, good for the animals. I mean, they're out on grass, they don't go to feedlots, they're even with their mothers at this stage. So you might think, well, this is sustainable, this is organic farming. And it's true, of course, that we're not wasting food, we are gaining food because we can't process this grass, and the cattle can. That's how they evolve. The problem is that when cattle digest anything, their stomachs produce methane. They have this special kind of ruminant stomach. Ruminants, cattle are the major ruminants, and sheep to a lesser extent produce methane in this country. Methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas. Now, unfortunately, the more roughage in the food, the more cellulose in the there is, the longer it takes them to digest it, and the more methane they will produce for each pound of food they produce. So, because there's all this cellulose they have to break down in the grass, and there isn't in the grain, they actually produce more methane eating grass than eating grain. One study said they produce 3 times as much methane. And that's really having a significant contribution to climate change. I said earlier that I thought the UN FAO report that said there was more emissions from livestock than from transport was underestimating the situation. Let me just take a minute to explain why I think that. Methane is typically regarded as being 25 times as potent a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide. And that's the figure that the FAO report used, 25 times. Now, it is 25 times as potent over a century. It's 25 times as potent over a century because after about 20 years, most of the methane has gone from the atmosphere. It breaks down quite quickly. Whereas most of the carbon dioxide that you put in the atmosphere today will still be there in 100 years. So if your time scale is a century, then 25 is the right factor to use to multiply methane, to get a carbon dioxide equivalent between methane and carbon dioxide. But we don't really have a century to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Most of the experts think that if we don't dramatically reduce them within the next 20 years, we will pass a tipping point where various feedback loops will start to spiral in. So for instance, one of the feedback loops is the melting of Arctic ice, which has already begun. Ice reflects the sun's light. That's why it's so glary when you walk on ice on a sunny day. When the ice melts, there's nothing to reflect it back, and it has a bigger effect in warming the sea than when it shines on ice. So that's a feedback loop. The warmer it gets, the more the ice melts. The more the ice melts, the warmer it gets, etc., etc. And there are others. The thawing of the permafrost in the north is another one because that contains methane. So if you focus on the next 20 years and say we have to do something dramatic about climate change in 20 years, then, because the methane is mostly still up there for that 20 years, the right conversion factor is not 25 but 72. And that's what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said in its most recent report. So if you factored methane at 72 times as powerful as carbon dioxide, then it wouldn't even be close between transport and livestock. Livestock becomes much more significant than transport. And just recently, the World Watch organization put out a report which saying this. So if you look at worldwatch.org, it gives much higher figures for the livestock contribution. Okay, we better move on because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So I'll just skim quickly through this. This is a University of Chicago study that showed that if the average US driver switched to a Prius, they'd save 1 ton of carbon emissions per year. That's great, that's a lot of emissions. Should all do that if you're not driving a hybrid, if you're not driving a bicycle, which is better still. But the average US consumer switching from their typical American diet to a vegan diet can save 1.5 tons of carbon a year. So you can make a bigger impact in reducing your carbon footprint by switching to a vegan diet if you're a typical American meat eater than by switching your car. Although, of course, why not do both? Okay, so I just wanted to, I'm coming close to the end of the thing, so I just wanted to say, well, there are some forms of farming that are reasonably sustainable. I'm not condemning all. The same farm that showed you the beef, the cattle near Princeton, also produces eggs. And these are egg-laying hens, very different from the battery cages, as you can see. I think these hens do have a decent life, and they're not producing any significant amounts of greenhouse gas emissions. So perhaps you might say these don't have the same problems. It's true, of course, that they will get killed once their rate of lay drops off, which is, as with human females, they stop producing eggs well before their normal lifespan is over. You know, there's that aspect of it. Plus, of course, the male chicks will all get killed as well because male chicks of an egg-laying variety are not raised for meat, so they're commercially useless. So there are still problems, but definitely this is, you know, if you're committed to eating animal products of some sort, eggs from hens like these are probably both the kindest to animals and the most ecologically sustainable. Let me quickly go through the case for buying organic, since we're talking about the ethics of what we eat generally. I think organic farming methods are more sustainable in the long run. They protect the soil. They don't need chemical fertilizers, which are part of the fossil fuel industry. And they lock up more carbon in the soil because the soils hold more organic content. They don't use synthetic fertilizers, herbicides or pesticides, which are also responsible for some of the pollution of rivers. They don't use GM plants or animals. Now that's a separate issue, and you might ask, well, you know, is there anything wrong with GM products? I think, you know, my view on that is not a single sweeping blanket view. I think you have to look at GM products on a case-by-case basis. So far, fortunately, we haven't had any major health or environmental disasters with GM crops. That doesn't mean that happy situation is going to continue forever. I think we need to be very careful in what we regulate, but I'm not saying that it's necessarily an unethical way to produce food. Organic animal products do not have antibiotics, steroids or hormones. The problem with antibiotics is quite well known now, that because non-organic animals raised in this country are typically fed antibiotics, a lot of the bacteria that we have develop resistance to those antibiotics. So it's interesting that all the major medical bodies, the American Medical Association and others, have called for an end to the routine feeding of low doses of antibiotics in animal agriculture. That's done because it helps animals to live and grow. It's not quite clear exactly why it helps, but it certainly does. Maybe it's because of the conditions in which they're kept that they need low levels of antibiotics. But it is done in most of the animal industries. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the American Medical Association is a very, very powerful political lobby group. And yet, when it came to trying to get a ban on routine feeding of antibiotics in animal industries, the American Medical Association found that it was facing an even more powerful opponent, and that's